Hi, everybody. My name is Curtis Mitch, and I'm with the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology, and welcome back to another one of our weekday reflections on the daily Mass readings. Today is a beautiful April 5th. It is Monday of the octave of Easter. And today's Gospel reading comes to us from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 28, verses 8 to 15. Now, today's Gospel is all about the empty tomb. Jesus was laid in the tomb on Friday. He remained in the tomb on Saturday, and yet he was not in the tomb on Sunday. What explains this? What accounts for this great mystery? Well, the Church tells us that the empty tomb is really the first sign of the resurrection of Jesus. It's the first sign of many signs, all right? There will be a whole sequence of other things that Jesus will do to demonstrate his resurrection from the dead. And so the empty tomb is not a complete sign in the sense that it doesn't amount to proof that Jesus rose from the dead. Why? Because it could be explained in more than one way, and that's precisely what we have in our reading today. But it is the first sign, and it's interesting that in Matthew's gospel, the empty tomb is a fact that no one disputes. All right? There are different ways to account for it. That's what today's reading is about. But it's a fact that is undisputed. And there are two groups of witnesses to the empty tomb in today's gospel. We have the women disciples who came to the tomb, and then we have the Roman soldiers who were stationed at the tomb for the entire weekend. And the women disciples come away from the empty tomb with a story that something miraculous has happened. This is a miracle. Jesus is risen. All right. The Roman soldiers, however, come away from the tomb, and they are paid money to tell a different story. This isn't a miracle. No, this is a hoax. Jesus isn't risen. No, Jesus' body was stolen. That's the story. And I think that what Matthew is trying to do is sort of answer this basic question. Which of these two stories is really credible? Which one is believable and which one is not? All right. And so Matthew, I think, in this particular passage of the gospel, has both that evangelical aim of preaching the gospel, of preaching the essential truths of the Christian faith, and the whole Christian faith rests upon the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. But he also has that sort of apologetic aim going on as well, that there are different stories in circulation, and Matthew's going to step in and set the story straight, right? He's going to help us understand what actually happened. So let's read the text, and then we'll try to extract some of its meaning for us. We begin in Matthew 28, verse 8. So the women departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy, and ran to tell the disciples. And behold, Jesus met them and said, "Hail!" And they came up and took hold of his feet, and they worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brethren to go to Galilee, for there they will see me." And while they were going, behold, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sum of money to the soldiers and said, "Tell the people, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So they took the money and did as they were directed. And this story has been spread among the Jews to this day. So as we said, we have two groups of witnesses here, and that's what we want to kind of look at and focus in on a little more closely. You have the women at the tomb, and you have the soldiers at the tomb. So first, the women. Who are the women at the tomb? In Matthew's account, he mentions only two. There are actually more than two, but these are the two that caught Matthew's attention. One, we have Mary Magdalene, and two, we have another woman, this is back in Matthew 28, verse 1, another woman who is called the other Mary. Now, who is the other Mary? Well, you have to turn back one chapter in Matthew's Gospel to kind of understand who that is. Okay? In Matthew chapter 27, verse 55, we are told that there were many women that came from Galilee. And those women not only followed Jesus to Jerusalem, they actually remained with him to the bitter end. They were standing afar off, witnessing the crucifixion of Christ. And among them, there was Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph. Now, earlier in the Gospel, we were told that James and Joseph are two brothers or cousins of Jesus. And so this is actually a family member, presumably a kinswoman of the Blessed Virgin Mary. That's who the other Mary is. She's the mother of these other two disciples who are related, in some sort of kinship relationship with Jesus himself. And what do we know about these women? We are told three things, not just one thing, not just that they witnessed the empty tomb, but that they were also witnesses to the crucifixion, and then they were witnesses to the burial of Jesus. All right? In other words, Matthew is helping us to see that they are authentic witnesses to what happened. They didn't mistakenly go to the wrong tomb. They were at the tomb. They didn't mistakenly think that Jesus died when he really didn't. They saw him brutally murdered and executed on the cross. That's who these women are. And when we first see these women in today's gospel, they're running. They're running with fear and joy. Fear because they just saw an angel from heaven come down and roll away the stone and caused an earthquake, and the angel looked like lightning and fire. And so they were afraid, and yet they were overjoyed at the same time because they were told that Jesus is risen. And this is why we say that these women at the tomb were really, in a sense, the first apostles to the apostles. They're the ones who first carry the message to Jesus' own band of disciples. Okay? And in this particular case, Matthew doesn't focus any attention on the sightings or resurrection appearances in Jerusalem that took place immediately beginning on Easter Sunday itself. He's actually focused on the end game. Right before Jesus ascends to heaven, Jesus will assemble his disciples on a mountain in Galilee and give them the Great Commission, where he will mandate for them, give to them the mission of evangelizing the entire world. So that's what's going on here. But in the midst of this, before they even reach the disciples, Jesus encounters them. And this encounter with Jesus, you will notice, is very, very specifically and purposefully described as a multi-sensory event. In other words, they not only see him with their eyes and hear him with their ears, they also touch him with their hands. Jesus is appearing to them and convincing them, bringing them to faith in the reality of his resurrection and in the full physicality of his resurrection. This is Jesus not as a ghost, this is Jesus in his body, returned from the dead. And so evidence for the resurrection is, in a sense, mounting. We move to the second stage. We begin with the disappearance of Jesus, right? That's the empty tomb, a fact that needs to be explained. But then in addition to his disappearance, now we have appearances of Jesus, where his first disciples actually see him face to face, hear him with their ears, and touch him with their hands. So that's the women at the tomb. But what about the soldiers at the tomb? They come out with a different story. And the question is why? And that's what Matthew's going to explain. The guard, some of the guard, Matthew says in verse 11, went into the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. Now, who is this guard? We're talking about Roman sentries, okay? They were commissioned to secure the site of the place where Jesus was buried. So no funny business would take place there. Nobody would tamper with the body, etc. So they not only interred Jesus in the tomb, they rolled the stone in front of it, and then the Roman soldiers put a seal on the stone to ensure that no one would tamper with it, or they would know if they did. But the curious thing here is that the Roman soldiers don't go to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. Instead, they go to the religious authorities in Jerusalem. They go to the priests instead of going to Pilate. And the question is why? Why would they do that? Because they're in trouble. All right? They are facing charges of a dereliction of duty. It was their job to secure the site, and failing to do so now means that they face not just shame and possibly, a dishonorable discharge from the Roman army. There could be very severe penalties on top of that, even possibly death. We don't know for sure. But they would be facing some pretty stiff ramifications for allowing this tomb to be tampered with and to find it empty in the end, when it was their job to ensure that no one touched it. Now, the chief priests deal with this account that they related to them with a sum of money. And they're really going to try to pay them off to tell the story differently. And so this sum of money, and this kind of reminds us as we're reading through the gospel, I think it reminds us, it's an echo of the story of Judas, right? That Jesus was betrayed with a sum of money, those 30 pieces of silver. And now, when another inconvenient truth presents itself to the high priests, again, they get out the money bag. We're going to try to stomp down this early Christian account by paying off the Roman soldiers. And what we learn about this money is that, on the one hand, it's bribe money. Okay? You're going to invent a new story. The chief priests say, we're going to give you the talking points. We're going to tell you what we want you to say to the people. So the sum of money is bribe money. But it's also, if you think about it, it's also hush money, all right? Because they're not just inventing certain facts, they're also called to suppress certain facts. That's what they're being paid to do, is not tell the story of their own experience. Because Matthew tells us that these guards were at the tomb. They saw the angel descend from heaven. They felt the earthquake, and they were paralyzed by fear at the sight of this heavenly being that looked like lightning and fire. Okay, so they have to invent a new story, but they also have to suppress the one that they actually experienced. And so they have to fabricate this new story. And the curious thing is that if you look closely at the story that they are telling, and this is what Matthew wants us to understand, there's a certain tension within that story itself. That story is problematic. They didn't take a whole lot of time to think through, all right, a way to explain this inconvenient fact. And what is this unresolved tension? Well, what they tell, what the chief priests say to the guard is, they say, tell the people that his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. Now, what's wrong with that story? How do you know it was the disciples who stole the body if all of you were sleeping at the same time, right? You can't be witnesses to something that happened while you were asleep. So there's a certain sort of tension in there. But even if we were to say, okay, well, maybe they just inferred that. That would be a reasonable assumption. Who else would take the body of Jesus other than his disciples? Well, that could be a reasonable inference. But in point of fact, this story doesn't make the soldiers look any better. The soldiers still look guilty because they're still asleep on the job. All right? And so the story, while it's not well thought through, it really presents itself as an act of desperation, a way to explain away this inconvenient truth, this remarkable story that we have no way to account for. And it's not insignificant that it's the chief priests who are most interested in suppressing the facts of the resurrection. Why? Because many of the chief priests were Sadducees. And we know that the Sadducees, unlike the Pharisees, did not believe in a resurrection. So Jesus' resurrection is not just, our political enemy has slipped through our hands and is presenting a danger to us once again. It's more than that. Jesus' resurrection is a decisive refutation of their theology. It's actually exposing them as Jews who are in doctrinal error, you might say. Anyway, so today's gospel is really then about the proclamation of the resurrection. That it's a story that is the story of a miracle, the miracle of Easter Sunday. It's not the only story in circulation, as Matthew the evangelist is well aware and points out to us, but it's the only story that is really credible, the only story that is worthy of belief. I hope this meditation was of some benefit to you today. I pray that God blesses you and your family and your day, and I look forward to seeing you here again next time. Thanks.